Our second speaker needs no introduction as he set the scene for us today. So, Tom, the floor is yours.
Yes, I'm afraid I'm back. That was a fantastic introduction, though, to my presentation now. I'm going to skip over the intro because we did that earlier on. But yeah, James is looking at very much the urban end of the same issue that I've been looking at and working on. So over the past sort of 2.5 years, I've been focusing on natural flood management. And by that, I very much mean the smallest end of the scale here. So we're talking very small installations that are going in typically very high up in the catchment. So geographically, the opposite end of the spectrum to what we've just heard about with the SUDS, which is very urban. This is talking about right high up in the catchment in very, very small streams. Ideally within the ephemeral streams, so the streams that only come up during big flood events. And this is an approach that is very much looking at little and often. So putting in very small natural flood management interventions, but in their thousands, so that cumulatively they have an impact on flooding. Now, really early on in this piece of work, I found that there's a number of sort of consenting hurdles to get over, none of them individually insurmountable. But when I moved across into my current role, I realised the situation was different all over the country. And so hence, I went charging off down this streamlining NFM consenting sort of work stream. And genuinely, I've done this presentation 5 or 6 times before I realised the horrendous pun in the title that I'm streamlining natural flood management. So what do I mean by NFM? So it's, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, NFM, natural flood management, is really about using natural processes to roughen up the surface of the catchment, to put more complexity back into watercourses in the catchment, to slow water down. And in many places, if you go into a woodland that's been completely unmanaged for a very long time, completely wild wood, you'll go in, you'll work your way up the watercourse, and you'll realise the entire watercourse is absolutely riddled with NFM that's already there because nature's already done it. Now, historically, what we've had is a number of tenancy agreements and contract requirements. And if you actually look at the flood drainage rules for landowners, there's a requirement for us to remove debris out of the watercourse. Now, quite what counts as debris is, up for debate. But for many, many years now, there has been this rationale of take wood out of the watercourses, because if you get the wood out, then the water gets down the watercourse quicker and it goes away and off your land. And what we've done is created an incredibly effective water delivery system into people's lounges, because the towns are all downstream and we're very good at getting the water down there very, very quickly. As I touched on this morning, when we then have the compounding issues around more of those flash flood events and prolonged periods of drought in between, we're just making the situation worse. As I said, in this particular project, I am looking very much at this really small scale. So in the picture here, we've got probably 2 or 3 what I would regard as NFM installations. In plain speak, they're sticks or logs in streams. Yeah, that's the scale at which we're talking here. So there's no diggers, there's no engineering works. There's plenty of other NFM approaches that do require much larger structures, much more design work, much more engineering. This is not about that. And that's a really important bit to remember when I'm going through the rest of the presentation. So the problem is dependent on where in the country you are and how much experience your risk management authority, which is typically the flood team in the local authority, have with natural flood management approaches. And this is by no means a dig at RMAs, because they've got a huge amount of work to do, and a lot of the projects they're doing are massive multi-million-pound projects that are genuinely keeping water out of people's lounges. you know, on the tens or hundreds of houses at a time type scale. And then some awkward git like me comes along and goes, I want some of your time to talk about putting sticks in streams. And there's only so many hours in the week, you know, and on one hand, they've got a £250 million flood defence scheme, and on the other hand, they've got Tom trying to put some sticks in streams. Now, if they've got prior experience of NFM, and they already know what I'm talking about before they get there, then that conversation's typically very different. If they haven't, and their entire career has been built around working with concrete infrastructure and traditional flood defences, and I turn up talking about sticks and really high up in the catchment, it's all just a little bit like, what are you going on about? And so that, very understandably, means that it takes a bit of time to get the awareness and the understanding in place, and to start working out where the consenting processes that are very definitely needed if you're going to pour a couple of thousand cubic litres of concrete are different to if you're going to take a chainsaw and chop off the end of a branch of a tree and put it into the stream. Yeah? But the legislative requirements placed upon them are broadly the same. And so, of course, we end up in a situation where both projects end up initially being burdened with the same consenting requirement. Beyond the flood team, you've also got the planning side of things. Now, for anyone who has had to deal with planning consents or planning policy Wales, it seems when you first get into it that it's very clear cut. You do need planning for this, you don't need planning for that. And then you start getting into the nitty gritty of it and you go, yeah, but what does engineering really mean? What does development really mean? And the nuance of that is very subtle. What we also have to remember here that I don't think many critics of planning authorities really fully grasp is that the planning authority, with the exception of the 3 national parks, the other 22 planning authorities in Wales sit within the same organisation that more or less looks after whether your grandma gets a decent level of care in her nursing home or not, whether your bins get collected or not, and whether the street lights stay on or not. So it's part of the local authority who are getting pulled budget-wise in every direction possible. And the planning authority has to make a judgment on that decision-making process. And part of that judgment is, if I get it wrong, and we're taken, it's not to court, is it? But if if it's taken to adjudication and we're found to be in the wrong, that's going to cost me far more than me saying, no, it needs planning consent at this stage. So it's sort of a trade-off of risk. And again, that's not the fault of the planning authority. That's the system that has been designed to make sure that people don't, for want of a better phrase, take the piss and wreck the natural environment. Yeah, that's what the planning system has been put in place to do. And so it wasn't a system that was designed for people who want to try and improve the natural environment to come along and work with it. And so again, now when we look across the entire country, it's understandable that different planning authorities are going to have subtly different approaches depending on their experience and depending on the people who are working there. I've lost the bottom of my screen. I'm going to have to remember the numbers now. There's also issues around tree felling and a couple of other consenting processes. But what this comes down to is that if a project to install, again, there's some NFM, some leaky woody structures in this picture over here. If a project to install these is held to the absolute letter of the law, you're going to be paying 460 quid for a planning application, plus all of the consultancy fees that go with it. You're going to be paying £50 per installation, so per log in the stream, for an ordinary watercourse consent. And to go with that, you're going to need a technical drawing, which in all likelihood is going to cost you 400 or 500 quid off somebody who's much cleverer than me on CAD to do that technical drawing. So to put in 25 leaky woody structures, which is what my contractors can do in a day, it's going to cost me about 500, 600, 700 quid to get them in on the ground to do the installation in the day. The worst case scenario is that the consenting side of the project is going to cost me 12 grand. And you can see right there that what happens is projects go, nah, forget that, and walk away. And so small-scale leaky woody debris just doesn't happen. So what we've been doing is, failing to use the clicker, what we've been doing is working with local authorities, both the flood teams and the planning teams, to set a precedent and come up with a streamlined consenting process that still, covers their backside from a legislative point of view. There's no doubt that they are doing their due diligence on these projects, but at the same time, it means that it's actually feasibly practical to do some of these installations from a project point of view. So we're in conversations with Welsh Government about just giving all planning authorities a nationwide guidance note on the phrase is de minimis. So it means that this type of work is engineering, but it's so small scale that it doesn't breach the point at which it would need planning consent. Now, Bannabrycheiniog National Park Authority have led the way on already creating that note internally for their own planners. That has been followed by a couple of other planning authorities. But instead of me going round 25 times all the planning authorities going, please will you do this too, if we can just get Welsh Government to do it, job done, and it comes from on high. And then we've gone for a lowered bar of ordinary watercourse consent. And so by that, what we've done is worked with the flood teams to go, how much level of scrutiny do you really need in order to make sure that you've done your due diligence over this kind of leaky woody debris installation? And so generally, the approach they've taken is that they will grant a single OWC consent per landowner rather than per installation, which is what the letter of the law says, and that we don't need to have the technical drawings of the features that are going to be installed before we get there, because in reality the tree surgeon doesn't know what bits of wood he's going to find until he's there on the day. So we put some example images in, and then we provide a report afterwards showing what actually went in. So they've got that scrutiny. The result is this. And I have to say, I am massively proud of my tech success right here, because those of you who do know me know I'm not tech savvy at all. But I managed to get that video to load. So it's really, really small scale stuff, isn't it? Yeah? But we're putting in hundreds and thousands of them. And so collectively, by putting thousands of them in, if each little installation like this holds back a cubic metre of water, or 2 or 5 cubic metres of water, collectively across the whole catchment, you can start getting to the point where you are holding back significant volumes of water and, as James was talking about, smoothing out that flow, that flood graph. So the water is held for longer. You can see it's leaky. It doesn't all just run straight out. It takes a while to drain out. But the spike, the peak, doesn't get as high. Yeah. What that means is that I was having a conversation earlier on with Craig, for the RMA consenting team, they get used to the sorts of work that we're talking about putting in. They know the method statement, they know the approach, therefore not every single application that goes in has to have full scrutiny. So it's less work for them. It's less work for planning teams because, if you know a planner who hasn't got enough work, then they're a rarity. All the planning teams in the country are absolutely up to here. As we touched on earlier on, they've got the phosphates nightmare to deal with. There's potentially a nitrogen headache also coming down the road towards them. They really don't need to be wasting time considering whether or not I can put a log in a stream or not. They've got real planning work to be doing. It's less work for those of us who are trying to get these projects consented. But critically, it means that landowners who are self-motivated and want to do this stuff are able to work their way through the consenting process themselves. It doesn't become something that is so burdensome it needs a technical specialist to be able to navigate their way through. And yeah, these installations are going in, average cost of sort of 15 or 20 quid per installation. So we're getting on average 25, 30 a day in with our folks installing. And we're providing wider benefits. So yes, there are certainly issues around this stuff being unmodelled and unprovable, and the monitoring isn't exact around it. It's not an exact science. This is hugely about replacing natural processes and about putting diversity of structures into the system. But we're also getting, we've had a fantastic report done for the US Catchment Partnership down south. The guys who've done it do quite like their weird acronyms. So RAFS is a runoff attenuation feature. To you or I, that's something that's going to get a little bit deep and boggy or floody during a big storm. Yeah, it's somewhere that water's going to get slowed down or held. And What they've now sort of helped us to create the evidence base to prove is that in areas where you've got nutrient runoff issues, by putting in this sort of nature-based solution towards intercepting surface water flows, you're also intercepting those nutrients. And as many of you will know, as water slows down, it's less capable of carrying sediments and gravels with it, and typically the finer sediments are the ones that get dropped out. The coarser ones get dropped out first. The finer ones are only going to get dropped out when the water slows right down, like it has done behind one of these runoff attenuation features. As those sediments drop to the bottom of the pool, then quite often the nutrients are bound to the sediments, so the nutrients go with them. And if it then dries out, that then gives the opportunity for the plants there. I think it was Joel was telling us earlier on, the plants are then able to fix and utilise those nutrients. So you then are intercepting the amount of nutrient that ends up in the river downstream. And the third benefit from a habitat biodiversity point of view, this is from the Woodland Trust. So wet woodlands are one of the rarest habitats now within Wales. You know, if we look at habitat diversity across Wales, we've got lots of big areas of very similar habitat and some very, very small patches of certain types of habitats. Wet woodland is one of them, and so many of the species that rely on it really desperate for more wet woodland. This whole project is very much focused on a very specific type of leaky woody debris intervention, and the rationale behind that is that if we can move this out of the realm of experts, and we can sort of unlock it and hand it over to the masses, then all those of us with a flood expertise background are able to step aside and go and focus our efforts on one of the other bits of the puzzle, because to resolve our flooding issues and our nutrient issues, we're going to have to take lots of different approaches, and we're going to have to do lots of different stuff. There is going to have to be concrete poured. There's going to have to be wetlands built. There's going to have to be suds installed all over the place. But this leaky woody debris NFM stuff doesn't need experts going over every single consent application. It doesn't need monitoring and modelling and all of that sort of stuff in the background. So if we're able to create a portion of NFM installation that is no longer a technical specialism, and go, this can actually be green lighted. You know, people can get their heads around this in a day's training and a quality assurance sign-off process. We can green light it and we can go, crack on, run with that. You know, and that might only be 10% of the catchment. But if we can fill that 10% of the catchment with thousands of leaky woody debris installations, and each one is holding a cubic metre of water, then the cumulative impact of that is huge, and it frees us up to go further downstream and think about the more complex stuff. So this is, apologies, it's probably too small for anyone to read, but I'm perfectly happy to send you a copy of this. This is the method statement that's been developed for the identification of sites that are suitable for installation of small-scale leaky woody debris as part of this streamlined consenting process. And the idea is that you would take this document and you would go to the site of interest to you and you'd work through it. And you know, it's almost a tick box exercise. You work down, and if the description on there fits the site in front of you, you go, cool, box ticked, move on to the next one. And if you get to one and you can't tick the box, then you probably need to go away and speak to an expert, a technical specialist, on whatever that issue might be. So, you know, C3, the last one there, is about protected species. Well, if you can't tick the protected species one at the end, then you probably need to go and speak to your county ecologist, or, you know, bring in private consultancy ecologists to help you understand the needs of that site better. But this method statement will fit hundreds or thousands of sites across North East Wales, probably thousands of sites, to be honest. And so what it'll allow is those sites to start being installed on, whilst we then focus those expertise elsewhere. There's still some unresolved risks, and one of the major hurdles that I come up against is this concept of unintended consequences. So there's probably a bunch of people sat in the room here going, oh, Tom's going to wreck this, that, or the other, you know, by doing this approach. That's going to happen. if we're installing hundreds of thousands of leaky woody debris installations across the entire country, at some point, somewhere, somebody will fell a timber that's got a moss or a bryophyte on it that is on the protected species list. It's going to happen, because whilst the data record centres are fantastic and the data they hold is fantastic, the lack of a data point showing that species exists there doesn't mean that species doesn't exist there. Yeah? So there is definitely a weakness within this system. But the alternative is that we burden all of our ecologists and all of our planners and all of our risk management officers and everybody else with having to scrutinise every single site. And that's what we've done up until now. And so if we continue down that road, you'll always do what if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. Well, that's NRW's assessment of, is that just the freshwater? I think that is just the freshwater assessment for Wales. Diversity, extent, condition and connectivity. Well, across Wales, 37% of freshwater habitats, from a diversity point of view, have got low diversity. 43% have got poor extent. 67% are in poor condition. And 33% have got poor connectivity. Now that's nobody's individual fault, but the process that we've gone through and the system that we've had has got us to there. And the trend is a declining trend pattern, isn't it? So if we are serious about altering that trend line, turning it around and improving the situation, then we're going to have to change the system that we're working with it. And that's going to be difficult, and there will be situations and times where we get that wrong. But if we are taking action in the thousands or tens of thousands of situations, then yeah, you can guarantee in one of those situations you will have a negative unintended consequence of some sort. But the payoff of that is that you've had 9,999 positive consequences. Now, we either go, okay, practically, I'm willing to sort of start dealing with those sorts of odds, or we go, no, we have to keep control of it in the way that we've kept control of it up until now. And my feeling is that the data is showing us that the way we've kept control of it up to now hasn't been working. And for anyone who's involved with budgets to do with Welsh Government, it's not like we can turn around to the Senedd and go, if you just double our budget, we're going to be able to fix this. Unless, I mean, Fionn appears to have run off now, but she seems to have worked out how to get loads of money out of people. So, you know, she'd probably run away because she realised we're all going to collar her and go, how do you get more money? Next steps. We're trying to integrate as much data, as much relevant data as possible into this so that we reduce the likelihood of those negative unintended consequences and we maximise the benefits of the installations we're doing. So this screen grab on the right hand side here, for anyone who hasn't seen this yet, this is the Dŵr Cymru surface water flow mapping, which is an absolutely fantastic resource that Dŵr Cymru, I'm pretty sure they've told me they are just going to do for the entire country and are then happy to share. Now, you know, I'm not going to forgive them all their sins, but I'm going to forgive them an awful lot if they can give us that data for the entire country. Because when we take that out on farm and we show it to farmers, they look at it and they, more often than not, the response they give us is, who produced that and how did you produce it? Because you lot out of offices never produce any data that's actually relevant and actually resembles what happens on my land. But this does. And so that is showing the surface flows where the water goes in the worst case scenario flood events. And if that shows you where the water goes in those worst case flood events, that tells you exactly where you need to go and do your surface flow interruption, your leaky woody debris or your bunds or your scrapes or your punch, your runoff attenuation features. So you can be a lot more targeted and strategic about it. If we start becoming more targeted and strategic, we're less likely to run into some of those unintended consequences. Part of this, you know, part of the reason that I'm keen to stand here and talk about this today is that I think we need to create a rising tide of understanding and ability across the whole of Wales. We've got some little pockets of incredible expertise and understanding around NFM in Wales. Some of you sat in this room are going to be going, yeah, Tom, we know all of this, get on with it. But we need to create that rising tide where generally across the board people understand more where this narrow end of the wedge is applicable and can help, and what needs to happen in order to do it. I would love to be in a situation where the limiting factor is that we do not have enough contractors to be able to install on the number of sites we've got. At the moment, I've got the opposite problem, that it takes me and the other officers involved in the consenting process too long to tick all of those sort of statutory boxes and get it into the hands of a contractor. More often than not, I'm having to knock contractors back or cancel them for days' work because we've just not been able to get through it. If we can streamline that, find that path of least resistance through that still holds everyone's statutory obligations in place, that would be fantastic. And ultimately, you know, I'm trying to identify and unlock those low-risk areas of the catchment, and they are typically going to be really high up in the catchment. As I said at the start, the little ephemeral streams, the places where if you put in hundreds or thousands of installations, they're going to sit there doing nothing until those peak flow events occur, and all of a sudden streams pop up in places they're not normally happening, and if you can intercept those flows, slow that water down, then you can help smooth out that flood downstream. Unbelievably for me, I appear to be finishing early today, so that's never ever happened before. If any of you would like to see the method statement, the risk assessment approach that we're using, you know, if you're trying to do natural flood management installation work and you're trying to navigate your own way through the ordinary watercourse consenting process, if you're part of a planning team and you want to understand the thinking behind Banabrycheiniog's approach to regarding this as de minimis and how they're still covering themselves from that point of view, get in touch. That QR code will take you to my LinkedIn profile. Please do stay in touch. And it's really a two-way process and a learning process. So that method statement has gone in front of probably a couple of hundred professionals now across Wales, working across all sort of different areas of water. But if it comes to you, you look at it and you go, good God, what's that doing on there? Please tell me, because it's a constantly evolving document. Thank you very much.